We will hear two presentations around the topic of the ethics of risks and autonomous driving. And I will now shortly introduce two of my co-speakers and colleagues. So first of all, Matthias Uhl. He is a professor at Technical University at Ingolstadt, focusing on social implications and ethical aspects of AI. And then we have Maximilian Geislinger. He's working as a research associate and PhD candidate at the Institute of Automotive Technology at TUM. And together with him, I am working on a project, Autonomous Driving Ethics, at the Institute for Ethics in Artificial Intelligence at TUM. And I would suggest that we start with our first presentation by Matthias on the risk ethics of autonomous vehicles pre and post collision. And you should now be able to share your video and your presentation as well. Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Franziska. You should now be able to see my presentation. Okay, perfect. So yeah, as Franziska already said, this is a project on the ethics of autonomous driving pre and post collision. So I'm going to present two projects. What they both have in common is that they empirically address the question of, like how autonomous vehicles should behave, so to say. And we picked both topics because we thought, like for the first one, the pre-collision question, that we should try to shift, like into the domain of risk here. And for the second, with post-collision behavior, like we are addressing a question which we think has not been addressed so far, or hardly been addressed so far. So I think both, hopefully at least, should be interesting. So as a starting point, like let's start with the usual trolley problem, and this is, of course, as you all know, the basic starting point, and like for most of the discussions on the ethics of autonomous driving, and that's of course also something that you very much read in the feuilletons. Like when this problem is discussed, it's very often about the trolley problem. I reckon that most of you are familiar with it, but let me just summarize the key idea. The key idea is that the trolley is heading towards the 5, and the person on the switch can deviate the trolley to the side track, just killing one. And the question here is, of course, should we do that? And this has often been compared, like to the problem that autonomous cars face. And this is, of course, the infamous moral machine experiment by Awad et al., where they were basically collecting millions and millions of choices and trying to understand how people would decide in these situations. And of course, the option here that people have, and here you can see that it basically resembles the trolley problem, is whether you should deviate the car and make it crash against the barrier, killing the passenger, but save the 5. So there is a strong similarity apparently between the autonomous car case and the standard trolley case by Philippa Foot from '67. The problem, of course, here is that the trolley dilemma presupposes a deterministic environment. So in this case, of course, all events are certain. It's very interesting. I mean, if you look at the entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia on the concept of risk, you can see that there are very different notions of risk being around. Like, so people are employing different definitions of what they mean when they say the term risk. And one way, like that, it's very often understood is that we should understand risk as, in this case, the accident probability. So the probability that the accident happens times the severity of the accident, which in this case could be 1 person is hurt or even killed versus 5 persons are hurt or even killed. And the argument, of course, is that when talking about autonomous driving, we are talking about a stochastic environment rather than a deterministic one. So we have to talk about risks. And the question, of course, here is what about these two factors? And it seems, like, of course, that the traditional problem, not only seems, it is actually the case that the traditional trolley problem and the translation to the issue of autonomous cars is focusing exclusively on severity, right? So here we are basically setting the probability to 1, and people are just deciding whether they want the more severe accident or the less severe accident, and whether they would be willing to intervene, so to say, in the course of events, or whether they think that a particular action should be undertaken, a certain maneuver, in order to save more people to the detriment of the few. Yeah, so that's the basic idea. If you talk to the engineers, on the other hand, like, you very often get the impression that they are not so much after severity, but mainly focusing on the accident probability. So what they are usually saying is, or very often saying, not all of them, well, it's all about accidents avoidance. And what you're discussing here in the ivory tower of philosophers, is just something, that is, I mean, extremely rare. And what we are basically having usually is totally different situations. People are basically shifting minor risks among road users, or allocating minor risks among different road users. So the question here, so it seems, like, in a way that the engineers are very much focusing on what in risk ethics is called primary safety. So it's to a large degree, it's about avoiding accidents. And of course, you can also think of other things like secondary safety, where you would, for instance, say, assume that the accident happens, how can we mitigate the effects of the accident, for instance, by the implementation of airbags or something like that. That would be a focus on secondary safety. So it seems that there are like two very incompatible notions of risk. And the problem is that both call it risk very often. We are just talking about risks in road traffic. And I think it is very helpful for a start, like to sensitize ourselves and others, like that we should be very clear about what we are talking about. Are we talking about accident probabilities? Are we talking about the severity of an accident? Or are we talking about the product of both? And the question, like, that we wanted to tackle in this study is, and that's a very legitimate question, is, of course, we know how people behave in the deterministic scenarios, because Rahwan and Abad et al. and others, like, have conducted several studies on this question, but we do not know very much about how people consider, like, these kinds of scenarios when we're talking about stochastic trolley dilemmas. And so what we were doing for a start is, you really have to see that basically what Google is doing, like, when we look at the algorithm, like, that decides about whether certain maneuvers should be undertaken, that they are implicitly already using such a notion of risk that I have just shown you. Because, for instance, like the bad event of getting hit by a large truck, there is a risk penalty that the algorithm imposes on a certain kind of maneuver. And what's basically done here is that the risk magnitude, which is nothing but the severity of the accident, is multiplied by the probability that this is going to happen. And the risk penalty in this sense is just the product of the two, right? So the question is, like, whether this, what Google is actually implicitly doing here, namely taking a certain idea of what conceptualizes a risk, is also, like, resembled by the intuitions of lay people, like by those who are ultimately subjected to a certain technology. So what we wanted to know is how people would decide in a stochastic trolley problem. And what we basically did is, like, we started off, like, with a classical trolley dilemma, and then we translated it to a context of a car, where a car basically had to position itself on a road, right, and it could get closer to one party or closer to another, and this would always come, like, with a minor shift of risk between the road users. And what we were interested in, whether people, like, would be willing, for instance, to divert the autonomous vehicle in such a stochastic setting. And what you can see here on the slide is basically the graph which shows you people's choices to divert the autonomous vehicle to kill a single person with a probability of with a very small probability of just 1%. And there is a probability of a fatal accident for a group of 5. So that's basically the logic of the trolley dilemma, right? If the AV is not diverted. So you can imagine in this situation that I'm showing you here, and we had like several contexts, you know, like the car is heading toward 5 people. Well, the car will hit the brakes, and it is quite likely that all the people will be saved, but it's not sure, right? And you can divert the trolley, you can divert the car, which will make it a bit more likely maybe for this single person to be hurt or even killed, right? And this is, you know, like fixed at 1%. So the first thing that we wanted to do is move, you know, like this whole idea of the trolley problem to a stochastic setting and see whether there is a disruption in people's choices, you know, because it could very well be that people, you know, like that the small probability or the smaller probability is very salient, and that people mainly want to avoid accidents, right? And they always go with a lower probability. Or it could be the case that what people actually do is that they multiply, you know, like, and they take, so to say, a weighted approach between the probability and the severity of the accident. So that's basically what we wanted to understand in this study. A very simple idea, basically. And what you can see is that people actually adjust, you know, like the proportion of diverting the autonomous vehicle to the probability that the fatal accident has for a group of 5. And what you can see is, like, if both probabilities are the same, so that's basically very similar to the standard trolley problem, right? It's just in a stochastic setting. You can see that most people, actually 90%, would be willing to divert the trolley. So I'd rather risk the life, not take the life, but risk the life of one person at the detriment to save the 5, although if this is not sure. So that's not maybe too surprising, because that's also what we find in the standard trolley case, in the deterministic one, and where you could say that these probabilities are canceling out, right? And what you can see is now, if we alter this probability, right, if we make it a bit smaller for the group of 5, you can see that less people are now willing to divert the trolley, but there is still a lot of people who want to do that, right? And notice that if people, you know, like, were keen on avoiding the accident, right, they would basically not be willing to divert the autonomous vehicle in this case, right? In the case where the probability of harming the 5, you know, like, is just half as high as the probability of harming the single person. But still, of course, most people, you know, would be willing to divert the trolley, which is not too surprising if you use the notion of risk that I have been introducing, and multiply the probability with the severity. And in this case, you know, like, where actually the risk defined as the product as probability and severity is exactly equal. So notice it's just 1%, you know, like, times the single person, and it's 0.2% for 5 people. So it's a statistical death, so to say, is the same in both situations. People are literally undecided between the two, right? Which I think is quite a nice and an interesting finding. So what I want to suggest by that is that it could be worthwhile, you know, like, to investigate these sorts of questions in a stochastic environment, and not only a deterministic one, to understand, you know, like, whether people's intuitions here differ substantially from what they're doing in the trolley. Doesn't seem to be the case that they're deviating too far, you know, like, from the logic, at least from this from these findings that I show you here. But they're taking a weighted approach, right? So they are looking at a balancing of risk and severity of the accident, and not just focusing on one or the other. And I think that's different. That's important to keep in mind. The second project that I just want to very briefly introduce to you is something that has been hitherto completely neglected, and that's the question of what a car should do after a collision, and an autonomous car. And that's an interesting question, because we have very clear regulations of what a human driver is supposed to do in case of a collision, namely stop at the scene of the accident, inform other drivers of the danger, and make the emergency call and help to clarify responsibilities. And there is not there is no regulation so far, right, on what the autonomous vehicle is going to do after the collision. So we are focusing very much on the pre-collision behavior, but we are not talking very much about post-collision behavior. And this is something that we tackled in a joint study with colleagues also from the UN. And what we basically find here, and I just want to give you some of the key findings, is that people do have a very strong preference, a very strong normative preference that the AV, and this is basically the lower. These are the lower graphs, that the AV should record the accident, should stop at the side, and should call the police. And the interesting thing is that also the empirical expectation, so not only the normative expectation is that the cars should do it, but also the empirical expectation is that cars are actually doing this, or that it is actually planned that the cars are going to do this, while basically we have a lack of regulation in that domain already. And the interesting thing is, like that it's not just that people want this is what we can see from our results. It's not just that people want this because they think then we gather maybe important information for improving the algorithms of the car in the future, but it seems, that people attach an intrinsic value to this sort of behavior. So they want, for instance, that in the case of an accident, something happens to clarify what has happened here, and that, for instance, the affected ones, maybe the families of the affected ones, are being informed about what has just happened in the accident, right? So there seems to be an intrinsic value attached to these sorts of behavior. And that's another question I would suggest that we are not really tackling when we talk about the ethics of autonomous vehicles, because we are so obsessed with the deterministic trolley dilemma. So to sum up, I think the ethics of artificial intelligence in mobility should be supplemented by an empirical dimension. So it's very important that we look at also lay people's intuition, also to engage in a true transdisciplinary discourse. In the case of pre-collision behavior, there should be a consistent consideration of uncertainty, at least of risk. We must at least consider stochastic trolley dilemmas. I'm saying at least. So what we just did, we're doing is trying to build a bridge between the traditional trolley literature, and move this more in the domain of risk, of what the engineers are telling us, and still trying, to enable some sort of discourse between the two sides, and maybe telling the engineers maybe what they are discussing in the domain of trolleys is not so far away if we just move into the domain of risk. And if there are any differences, if there are disruptions, we should be very clear of where these disruptions come from, right? Post-collision behavior is another topic in the ethics of autonomous driving that has received little attention, we would argue, so far. What we can say here, that there is a certain divergence between people's moral intuitions here about the importance of post-collision behavior and the regulations that we have in this domain so far, because people are only focusing, or mostly focusing, on pre-collision behavior of autonomous vehicles. So empirical studies on the intuitions of the population are essential to be able to consider their value judgments, to basically feed them back into a democratic discourse, and also, of course, to clarify the concepts, and help us to engage in a discussion. So thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for your insights, for sharing your insights with us on the question to what extent actually the mere minimization of risk in ethical dilemmas corresponds to public view or not. As you will see, Maximilian and I will present very similar ideas now, which makes me quite happy that we as researchers go in the same direction and discuss similar things. But before that, I just want to remind the participants, if there are any questions or comments, feel free to just write us in the chat, or use the raise your hand function. If there are no questions, I will suggest that Maximilian and I will now present one potential practical approach that actually aims to combine what you mentioned, Matthias, the balanced view of risks and harm. And yeah, I'm curious whether what you will think about our presentation and our approach. So yeah, now we would like to give you a short summary of our research project, Autonomous Driving Ethics. We will share some first results with you, as well as tell you a bit with how we came up with the final research focus. So again, I would like to state that we are working together in an interdisciplinary team, and that consists on the one hand of Maximilian, who's working at the Institute of Automotive Technology, and then me from the chair of business ethics. And as we encountered, or as we started with the research, we encountered these two types of perspectives, or these two types of trade-offs. On the one hand, you have, you know that all the leading automotive groups or technology companies are researching and developing autonomous vehicles because, of course, they're linked to a lot of advantages, such as higher comfort for passengers, but also higher safety because factors like microsleep or unadjusted speeding can be eliminated. But also, at the other hand, you have these issues that are discussed by society or citizens that press all the drawbacks that come with autonomous vehicles. You may know of some fatal crashes that have happened in the past, but also just in general, society seems to mistrust the functionality of autonomous vehicles so far. So therefore we see the urgent need to catch up on the ethical considerations in the field of autonomous vehicles. And therefore we would like to show you now what our intersection or our project actually is. As we started to investigate the different ethical considerations or questions in the field of autonomous driving, we saw there's a handful. So on the left-hand side, you see the issues that are purely technical or engineering issues, and then on the right-hand side, you see some ethical considerations, such as should you label AI? So should they expose themselves when they're driving on the streets, but also what is the influence of autonomous driving on human agency, self-determination, and control? And as Maximilian and I, we are an interdisciplinary team, and therefore, of course, our wish was to combine both our research interests and expertise as much as possible. And therefore, we decided on a specific topic for the Andre project, namely the investigation of the question of how to integrate ethical behavior into the trajectory planning of autonomous vehicles. And therefore now, because that's why I was mentioning, Matthias, that we go into the same direction. At the start of our research, we also encountered the famous and very old thought experiment called the Trolley Problem. You mentioned already what the thought experiment is essentially about. The ethical question that arises here is whether one person's death can be accepted to save the lives of 5 people. And then also more recently, which you already showed as well, Matthias, is the moral machine experiment, which was developed by MIT. This was, or actually still is, an online experimental platform designed to explore individuals' preferences in moral dilemmas faced by autonomous vehicles. I would like to point to some shortcomings of these theoretical considerations. For example, the dilemmas situations are very rare happenings in practice. And also what was mentioned earlier, if you look at the indicated situations in these thought experiments, you can see that the consequences are postulated as certain events. So you have definite death, definite life, and there's no in between. There's a limited number of options that you can do. So you can swerve left or swerve right. And as already mentioned before as well, uncertainty is completely disregarded in these kinds of thought experiments. Therefore, the thought experiments that have been addressed in the past, they're just way too static and to represent reality. And therefore now we would like to present, we would like to present our approach. And as you can see, also scholars and practitioners in the past have also pushed for the need to consider the concept of risk instead and move away from all these trolley dilemma problems. Therefore now, Next slide, please. Thank you. We would like to present you our approach with which we try to actually offer a practical solution and move away from this theoretical debate. And our main stance is that we should instead decide about how to distribute risks fairly, and not just in these dilemma situations, but also, and even more so, in much more mundane situations, meaning at every moment during which the autonomous vehicle is actually driving. And how does it work? So to elaborate, let's have a quick look at the two illustrations here. You can see risk can be determined by the lateral position of the autonomous vehicle in the middle. And by reducing the distance to the cyclist, the risk is shifted towards the cyclist, since the harm for the cyclist is assumed to be greater in the event of a collision with the autonomous vehicle. And then on the other hand, if you reduce the distance to the truck, then in case of an accident, the risk would be shifted to the autonomous vehicle and away from the cyclist. So our guiding research question that now arises is, so what does that mean? How can a fair distribution of risk be realized? And therefore, to answer this question, our project is clustered into the following work packages. So we started off with a literature review to just gain a comprehensive understanding of what is out there, what has academics and scholars have been working on in the past. And then the next steps are, on the technical side, develop a motion planning framework that considers the calculation and the distribution of risks. And on the ethical side, we aim to determine what is a fair or ethical distribution of risk in the field of autonomous driving, and also how would individuals distribute risks in traffic scenarios. So very similar to what Matthias just presented as well. And in our last work packages, we would like to carry out the empirical evaluation of all of the upstream work packages. So what we mean by this is that we would like to test and compare individual frameworks that we have developed within the project in simulations. And now I will hand over to Maximilian so that he can share a few of our first results.
Yeah, thank you, Franziska. Yeah, so far we've seen a lot of motivation to use ethics of risk in autonomous vehicles. And I think this is the perfect moment to start talking about how we will integrate it into software. And before we start with that, there is even one more motivation. And this comes from an expert group from the EU Commission. And they share 20 recommendations that we should consider when we want to program an ethical autonomous vehicle. And I want to follow up with 3 points of these 20 recommendations. The first thing is the question of a fair risk distribution. So we've heard it before with Franziska. The next point is we want to consider responsibility. So risk also poses the question, who is responsible for that risk, and how may we consider this when we talk about a risk distribution? And the last point is a positive risk balance that is demanded by scholars or industry if we compare it to a human driver. And this poses the question of, is there a maximum risk that we can see as acceptable and may never exceed? So these are the 3 points that we want to integrate into our software. And before we can do that, we have to talk about some technical fundamentals. And I'm very happy that a lot of this was already introduced by the previous presentation. So yeah, we're also working with risk and also define it as the product of collision probability and harm. And what you see here is that it is somehow a recent topic of research, as we use different terms as the previous presentation did. So a definition or this equation helps us to calculate and quantify risk as an autonomous vehicle. And therefore we can assign a risk value to every road user, not only for us as an autonomous vehicle, but also to everyone else. And the most important thing is we can link this risk assessment to our trajectory planning. So whether we choose trajectory A, B, or C in this example, we have different distributions of risk. You see it in this visualization. The more I go to the C variant, the more risk the cyclist will have. So this is extremely important to have that link in order now to actively distribute risks in our algorithm. And now that we can have that link, I want to introduce you to our distribution principles. We were thinking about several principles that we want to consider in our fair distribution of risk. And the first principle is called utilitarianism. I'm sure you know it, and utilitarianism just means we try to minimize the overall risk. However, this alone is not enough, because minimizing the overall risk does not account for equal distribution of risk. So the second principle that we want to consider in our risk distribution is equality. The third one is also known from philosophy, is called the Maximin Principle. And the Maximin Principle tries to minimize the greatest possible harm, no matter at which probability. So in general, and in this case of an autonomous vehicle, this could mean to avoid death. Our fourth principle is a maximum threshold. Like, we're looking for a threshold that risks must never exceed. As I said, the maximum acceptable risk. And the last point that we want to consider is the question of responsibility. So the general meaning is that risk should be, at least in parts, carried by those who are responsible for the risk. The most important thing at this slide is that we do not only have a description with words, but we also have mathematical formulations. This is extremely important to move forward and bridge the gap from philosophy into real software code at the end. And on the implementation level, you will find that the first three principles can be implemented by as an optimization problem. The maximum thresholds are some kind of validity checks, like we can do a binary check if a trajectory does hold this assumption of that maximum risk or not. And the last one, the responsibility, is a multidimensional problem, and I will talk about this now. If you're interested in more details about our distribution principles, I would like to share with you our paper, which you will find with this QR code here. So let's talk about responsibility. There are several reasons for responsibility in road traffic. The first reason is a violation of rules. Like, just imagine a pedestrian is crossing a red light and is therefore responsible for a possible collision with an autonomous vehicle. The next reason for responsibility, or the next principle, could be role-based. Like, imagine we have road traffic without any cars and only pedestrians, then most probably we would not have any deadly accident anymore. So vehicles, because of their high speeds and their high masses, do also, just because of their role as being a vehicle, bring risk into traffic situations. And that's also something that we argue should be considered here. And what's interesting about this point is that we see a trend to huge vehicles with more mass, because one of the reasons is they are safer somehow. So if you collide with a Porsche Cayenne and a Smart, for example, the Porsche Cayenne is the safer option for sure. And that would be also a possibility to counteract this trend at the end and make it more fair. And the third reason for responsibility is due to space of actions. Consider you're driving on a road and someone is driving behind you. Then if there will be a potential collision, the car driving behind you would be more responsible, as he has a greater space of actions to avoid this accident. I think this is pretty intuitive, as we know it from the German traffic regulations, right? So now we've seen several principles, and the task is now to put it all together. And what we do is we developed a risk cost function with the calculated cost from base, equality, maximin, and also responsibility. And we do not just sum them up, but have a weighted sum of them. So we can find the balance between base, equality, and so on. And the question now is, if we introduce those weights mathematically, how do we obtain the weights for different principles? And this is a question which goes beyond the question of a fair autonomous vehicle and is much more a question about what is the society that we want to live in? Do we want to live in a utilitarian society? How much do we account for responsibility? And so the question is bigger than autonomous driving. And one thing that we will try to find some answers for these weights is like asking people in user studies. Yeah, we've seen that before, that this is an instrument to get some feedback here. And therefore, I would like to give you a short example. Just keep in mind from previous slides, we have the pedestrian who is crossing a red light and therefore 100% responsible for a potential accident. In that case, the autonomous vehicles, for reasons for simplifications, is not responsible at all. Now you have 5 options to distribute the risk among these 2 road users. Option A would mean that the pedestrian has a risk of 1.0, which is the maximum amount of risk and can be somehow interpreted as a safe death. On the other side, if we choose option E, the pedestrian would have no risk at all, and the self-driving car would have a lower risk of 0.4. I mean, this is also plausible as the one sitting in the car is better protected than the pedestrian. So on the one hand, option A would argue for responsibility principle, while option E would argue for utilitarian principle. And B, C, and D are in general options in between here. So we took this question and conducted a little experiment at the IEAI Mobility, which is the biggest automotive fair in Germany. And first of all, the results are not representative, and we do not find them scientifically valuable in some contexts. But we took 2 learnings from it. So we got the results from more than 200 participants. And the first learning that we took, people really are interested about this question. So there were a lot of discussions, and people want to know how their potential autonomous vehicle would behave. And the second learning was that people do not choose one of the options, either A, which was the responsibility principle, or E, which was the base principle, but they do balance these principles. And in this case, they voted mostly for option B. And this helps us to calculate values for those weights and have an initial algorithm here. So now that we understood our algorithm in theory, let's look at some simulations. I'm sure you remember the example from Franziska with that truck on the left and the bicycle on the right. That's what we simulated with our algorithm. On the left side, you see our algorithm with a selfish risk distribution. This algorithm tries to minimize the risk of the autonomous vehicle. On the right side, you see an algorithm with a fair risk distribution. And in that case, as we have no weights yet, we distribute the principles equally. And what we see here is that, first of all, we have to zoom in to see any difference. And if we do that, we see that in the case of a fair risk distribution, the distance to the cyclist is greater than in the case of a selfish risk distribution. So this can be some kind of proof of concept. More importantly, we see that the risk for the cyclist in the case of a fair risk distribution, which is the green line here, is much lower than in the case of a selfish risk distribution. But therefore, the risk for the autonomous vehicle here in blue is only slightly higher in that case of a fair risk distribution. And this topic is also addressed by the EU Commission to redress the inequalities for vulnerable road users. So we do not only test our ethical algorithm in a single scenario. No, we audit our algorithms in more than 2,000 scenarios. So we're simulating scenarios. There are from city, highway, country roads, different countries. And at the end, we have 30 million trajectories to evaluate our ethical algorithm on. And what we do in that evaluation, I want to show you quickly here. I was introducing a cost function between those principles. And this generally assumes that we have a trade-off between different principles. But we wanted to know these trade-offs, we can imagine them, but do they really occur on road traffic? And this is why we were looking at some correlation coefficients between two principles. And what we're seeing here, for example, if we look at the correlation between Bayes and equality principle, is we see that in general, they are highly correlated. And maybe this would suggest that we do not need to distinguish here. But what we also find is that we find single scenarios like this one, where we see a trade-off between these two principles. And this might be a next step to look at these scenarios, cluster them, and therefore find an ethical scenario library. So this is one thing that we are going to do in the next steps here. And now I would like to hand back to you, Franziska.
Thank you very much, Maximilian. Yes, so at the end of our presentation, we just once again would like to point out why you should care about the topic of integrating ethical reasoning or decision-making into autonomous vehicles with pressing some ethical reasons to do so. So for example, this year, Maximilian and I participated in a documentary on autonomous driving, and there was also one engineer from Daimler who said that their key requirement is actually accident avoidance and safety. But when you look at what happened with some autonomous vehicles in the past, you see that there are actually accidents happening with autonomous vehicles, and therefore autonomous vehicles will in the end need to make some ethical decisions. And also safety as a key requirement does not equal fairness, in the sense that you could program an autonomous vehicle to increase, for example, the overall safety for all traffic participants on average, but still you have some minority traffic participants who may bear higher risk levels of risk in the end. And also different ethical principles can lead to different results in the sense of different behaviors or actions of the autonomous vehicles, because what we try to show within this presentation is that each ethical theory ascribes ethical relevance to different factors, so that, yeah, in the end, you may face different actions that you need to determine which are correct or which you want an autonomous vehicle to conduct in the end. And in case you're not convinced by all these arguments I just presented, I want just to give you also some practical reasons for why you should care about this topic. So first of all, some ethical principles are more acceptable to society than others, which was shown by different studies in the past. So therefore, just to industry, it might be interesting to look at this research that we've conducted, or that the research in the field of autonomous driving in general, to increase customer satisfaction. And another point is some ethical principles are more transparent than others. So therefore, this topic is kind of important for liability or accountability issues. For example, the exact behavior for a utilitarian autonomous vehicle is different in the sense that it by pursuing kind of unrestricted optimization, it may be less foreseeable or less transparent what actions may actually occur in the end, compared to, for example, deontological autonomous vehicles that answer to strict rules or constraints. And then last but not least, one argument that we have pushed already a few times in this presentation, it's simply because policymakers such as the European Commission have pressed that it's important that we manage dilemmas by principles of risk distribution and shared ethical principles, and therefore approaches like these that we've presented today may actually come into practice in the future. And therefore, to sum up, I would like to show you a little bit what our expected results of the Antwerp projects are. So first of all, we of course would like to extend the scientific debate by pushing towards ethics of risks and away from these theoretical discussions. Secondly, we would like to provide practical recommendations and also within AI for People, we were already involved this year in developing ethical guidelines for the automotive sector. And also we discussed with the European Commission on their initiative of mobility, how we could actually generate tangible software to push towards practical solutions and not just talk and papers. And also the last point that for us, it's very important to engage the society, speak to citizens, and therefore, for example, as mentioned already before, we went to the International Automobile Fair in Munich this year and just talked to stakeholders, talked to citizens, and shared our insights. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed all of our presentations. If you are interested in staying up to date with what Maximilian and I are working on, feel free to follow our research project or just drop Maximilian or me an email. Thank you. So if anyone from the audience has a question, feel free to just raise your hand or ask to the chat. In the meantime, maybe Matthias, I'm curious what you think about our approach to the ethics of risk.
I think it's very interesting, and I think we should definitely talk. maybe have a joint workshop. Should definitely talk more. So there is one thing that came to my mind, but now I don't want to abuse the chance to ask the first question. But do you think? I mean, you've presented all these different like ethical principles, and one thing that immediately came to my mind, and especially when you were showing like these different trajectories and saying, like there are these different options, like the fairer allocation of risks or the more selfish one. Do you think that there is a possibility to account for individual risk preferences in that respect? So basically to say, I would be willing, like to take more risks myself being in a car and get monetary compensation for that or something like that? Do you think that there could be a more individualistic solution to this sort of problem, or would we have a one-size-fits-all solution? I find that very interesting. Probably the economist.
So I can give a technical answer on that, and maybe Franziska can take a look at the other side. So from a technical point of view, that's what our approach would be open for. Yeah. So these weights that we were talking about, they could be individual for like any culture, but also for any individual user. And at the end, we could also introduce some values as selfishness, and also some authors or some other scholars proposed, and the more selfish a vehicle is, the higher the insurance will be, or something like that. Maybe what we may not forget, that in a collision, there are always two people involved, and we cannot increase the risk only for one. Maybe that's something that we should keep in mind. So I'm not sure about how to do it. Maybe Franziska, you have a.
So similar to you, I wanted to answer that the cost function kind of that we are proposing is more or less like flexible with the weights we're introducing, and whether we would then like top down let the individuals decide how they want to distribute the risks, the weights, or how they want to set the weights, are very flexible and open to discussion, I think. And that was one question that also actually came to my mind, because our approach at the moment is that we would like to find out what the preferred weights of these different ethical principles are. But of course, it doesn't state that what individuals then give us as a solution, as a proposition or a suggestion, is actually the correct answer to how we should then implement this into the autonomous vehicle. So my question, I guess, would also be, do you have a solution of how, apart from a user study, find a way to know which weights to determine in the end?
So you're asking me?
Yeah, sorry, Matthias.
So no, I think it's an extremely complex problem, because you have the additional problem that people, you know, are not at one with themselves, because depending on when you ask them and in what situation you ask them, they will give you very different answers. So for instance, you know, like they will probably, once they are on the road and you ask them when being placed in the car, they will obviously have a very different, express a very different preference regarding these weights, you know, than when they are, you know, like making a reflected statement. So it's not that people are at one with themselves. So it's not that only that you have divergence between people, but, you know, like we are changing our mind all the time. So I think the question of what are the right weights is I think extremely difficult to answer, I would say.
Yeah,
my answer is no, I don't.
Yeah, we totally agree, because Maximilian and I had a lot of discussions about this as well. And I think actually this questions of what are the right ethical principles to implement and what are the right weights to implement is not a topic only concerning the autonomous driving or autonomous vehicles, but actually every technology there is that will be integrated with some kind of like ethical reasoning or ethical decision-making process. So yeah, I mean, I haven't received any questions yet from the audience, so I would suggest that we close the discussion for today. But I think I speak from Maximilian.
There is one question, Franziska.
Perfect. Klaus Wagner, I will now unmute you.
Thank you very much. This is a very impressive work. I am amazed, and really, I found your paper. Meanwhile, I will study it carefully. I would like to address this situation with the pedestrian at the red traffic light. So this raises the concern. This is a very special case where you say the pedestrian it's the pedestrian's responsibility 200%. And I think that maybe this will in Germany not always meet what the judges say. They will say there is always the car driver who has some responsibility. He has to be aware that some pedestrian makes a fault or is not careful enough, not attentive enough. How can you tackle this point?
So yeah, first of all, I totally agree with you. And as I said, these responsibility assignments were due to simplification. So I totally agree with you, 100% responsibility, especially if there is a collision with a car and a car has 0% responsibility, is not realistic. So this was just to make it easier to calculate like weights out of it, because otherwise it would be hard to, also as a human being, we easily think black and white. And so maybe the situation does not fit to the values in this case. Yeah, but in general, also there are also these values are pretty similar to the weights that we've seen before. Like we do not have an answer, and also I just showed some on that one slide, but that doesn't mean that we want to say this is the value for it. It's not even a suggestion. It's just to show that there is a possibility to put values behind it and to make it programmable this way. But for the moment, these are placeholders. And as we had the discussion, this is pretty similar to the weights of the distribution principles.
Thank you.
And what I would like to add also is, because that was actually one of the scenarios or situations that we showed to the citizens at the IAA. And when we talked to the people, they were like, it doesn't matter whether the pedestrian crossed a red light or not. In the end of the day, the autonomous vehicle or the cars in general brought the risk to the street and not the pedestrian. And therefore, the autonomous vehicle should bear most of the risk. So I think there's still a lot of debates that have to take place concerning who is responsible in this kind of situation, and who should be the responsibility in the end. But I think in general, what I personally at least found out when I was talking to the individuals at the IEAI was that it shouldn't be the uninvolved participants or traffic participants, such as the pedestrians, who don't actually bring a lot of risk into the road traffic scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Maybe can I add a further question or maybe an idea?
Sure.
So let's talk a little bit about robot-machine interaction. So the robot is the machine and the pedestrian is the human being. And in cognitive psychology, the point is you would like to make a forecast what the agents may be doing in the next moment. So I made what for me is the paradigm example is a handover experiment. You know, I give you a pencil, you take it. This works anytime. I give it to you, you will take it, as easy as that. But if you delineate it, it's very complicated. So would it be possible for any AI to observe the pedestrian and tell what will he do most probably in the next second, as maybe an industrial robot who can do this experiment? Meanwhile, an industrial robot knows how to react in this handover experiment. And could an automobile do the same?
So yeah, the simple answer is yes, and it does at the moment. So at state-of-the-art autonomous driving software, what you call forecasting is more known as a prediction module. So what the autonomous software does all the time is making a prediction about all the dynamic obstacles, about the pedestrians, about other vehicles. So this is pretty much standard. But the problem is not the case when the prediction was right. And the prediction will be right in 99.99% of the cases. The problem will occur when this prediction will not be right. And that's what we're talking about. And maybe just to make that clear, in this example, both parties, or at least the autonomous vehicle, will do everything to avoid this accident. And such situations, and this is also very simplified, which is also the difficulty when we want to talk to a larger group of people. We have to simplify things, and things are not that simple. So there are complicated things before that this failure somehow could occur. And what you described with that interaction prediction, that is state-of-the-art in autonomous driving, and our software, our ethical algorithm, this is what it does, like a prediction of every traffic participant and calculate collision probabilities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.